The sky was gray the morning the funeral began, the kind of sky that carried the weight of sorrow in its clouds. The cemetery was lined with rows of soldiers in uniform, their boots polished, their medals gleaming, their faces solemn. A great general was being laid to rest, a man who had commanded respect across nations. Through the crowd walked an old man, frail yet steady, his white hair glowing under the dim light. His coat was worn, and in his hand he carried a single red flower. When he approached the gates, 2 young guards crossed their rifles before him. "Sir, this is a restricted ceremony," one of them said firmly. The old man's eyes filled with pain. "I was his brother in arms. I fought beside him when the world was on fire. Please let me say goodbye." But the guard, hardened by protocol, shook his head. "I don't have time for this, Grandpa. Please step back." The old man's shoulders sank, but he didn't move. His trembling hand reached into his pocket, pulling out a faded photograph. 2 young soldiers in muddy uniforms, standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling despite the chaos of war. One of them was the general. The other was him. The guards shifted uncomfortably, but rules were rules. The old man turned as if to leave, his flower still clutched in his hand, his heart breaking at the thought of walking away, without honoring the man who once saved his life. And then silence fell over the field. Every soldier snapped to attention as a car door opened. From it stepped a towering figure in full-dress uniform, a 4-star general. His medals shone like fire, but his expression was soft when his eyes found the old man. "Hold everything," the general commanded. The entire procession froze. He walked up to the frail veteran, taking the man's hand in his own. "Sir," the general said with reverence, "you have more right to be here than any of us. You were his brother before the world ever knew his name. Walk with me." Tears welled in the old man's eyes as the guard stepped aside. He was led to the front, to the flag-draped casket, where he laid the single red flower. His knees gave way, but the 4-star general caught him, steadying him with the respect of a nation. In that moment, the funeral was no longer about rank or medals or glory. It was about 2 soldiers who once fought side by side, one being honored, the other finally allowed to say goodbye. The silence broke not with words, but with the sound of taps echoing across the field. Every man and woman present knew they had witnessed something greater than ceremony. They had witnessed loyalty that death could not erase. The taps had faded into silence, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the rows of flags. The old man stood frozen, his red flower resting on the casket. His hands trembled, not just from age, but from the memories rushing back like a flood. He could no longer hold back. The 4-star general placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and respectful. "You knew him when he was just a soldier, didn't you?" he asked softly. The old man nodded, his voice cracking as he spoke. "We were boys when we went to war. We promised each other we'd make it home. He kept me alive more times than I can count. And now he's gone." The general's gaze hardened with emotion. "Then today you don't just say goodbye, you remind us all who he really was. Not just a general, a brother." The soldiers, who only knew the general as a distant figure of authority, suddenly leaned closer. The old man pulled the faded photograph from his pocket again, holding it up with shaky fingers. "This was us, covered in mud, half-starved, scared out of our minds. But we had each other. That's what got us through." A murmur rippled through the formation. Some soldiers straightened their backs, others wiped at their eyes. The funeral shifted in meaning. It was no longer about the pomp of rank, but about the humanity of the man being honored. The general raised his hand. "From this moment on, this man is not a guest. He is family. He has earned his place among us." The guards who had once blocked him now saluted sharply, their eyes lowered in shame. The old man didn't scold them. Instead, he gave a faint, forgiving smile. He understood they were young, following rules. Once, long ago, he had been like them. As the ceremony ended, the old man lingered by the grave, whispering words only he and his fallen friend could hear. "Rest now, brother. I'll be seeing you soon enough." And when he finally walked away, every soldier present snapped to attention, not for the general, but for the frail veteran who had carried the weight of brotherhood across a lifetime. As the old man turned to leave the gravesite, the youngest of the guards, the very one who had refused him, broke rank and hurried forward. His voice shook as he spoke. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't know." The old man placed a trembling hand on the soldier's shoulder, His eyes, though weary, held no anger, only understanding. "You did your duty, son. Never apologize for that. But remember, behind every medal and every rank, there's a story. Never forget the men who came before you." The guard nodded, his eyes burning with shame and newfound respect. The general, watching this quiet exchange, stepped closer. "What's your name, soldier?" he asked. "Private Collins, sir." The general's voice thundered, but his tone was not of anger, it was of teaching. "Private Collins, today you've been given a lesson that no academy can teach. This man you turned away carries more honor in his years than we could ever put on our chest. Carry that lesson with you for the rest of your service." "Yes, sir." Collins snapped to attention, tears threatening to spill. The old man gave a small smile and began his slow walk down the grassy path. But the soldiers in formation did something unexpected. One by one, boots clicked, and salutes were raised not toward the general, not toward the casket, but toward the frail figure of the veteran. A wave of respect followed him, a corridor of salutes stretching to the gates of the cemetery. He walked with his back straighter than it had been in years, every step heavy with memory, but lifted by the honor bestowed upon him. The weight of loneliness he carried had, in that moment, lightened. He was no longer forgotten. He was family again. As he reached the gates, the general called out, his voice carrying across the field, "Soldier, you are dismissed, with honor." The old man paused, his eyes glistening. He turned his head just enough to whisper back, "Thank you, brother." And with that, he stepped beyond the cemetery walls, his red flower left behind. But his story, his brotherhood, forever, carried on in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The cemetery gates creaked closed behind him, but the sound did not silence the storm in his heart. Each step on the cracked pavement was heavy with memories. The red flower he had left on the casket seemed to bloom inside his mind, pulling him back to a world of smoke, mud, and thunder. He was young again, barely 20. The jungle smelled of death, and the sky burned orange with fire. Bullets tore through the air like angry hornets. His breath came in ragged gasps as he huddled in a trench, blood trickling down his arm. Next to him was the same man who now lay beneath the folded flag, the general, then only a lieutenant. "Stay with me, Jack." The young lieutenant shouted over the roar of mortars. His eyes burned with determination, not fear. "We promised, remember? You don't die here. Not today." Jack, the old man, nodded weakly. He remembered the pain, the fire spreading through his side. He remembered wanting to give up. But the lieutenant had thrown himself into the open, dragging Jack out of the line of fire, carrying him on his back through mud and blood until they both collapsed. Behind a smoking wall of rubble, Jack had begged him to leave. "Go, save yourself." But the lieutenant only gritted his teeth and whispered fiercely, "Not without you. Never without you." The memory blurred, dissolving into another. A night raid, rain pouring down in sheets. The two of them crouched under the cover of shattered trees. The lieutenant pressed a hand to Jack's chest. "If we make it out, you find me when we're old. We'll drink, we'll laugh, and we'll remember the ones who didn't come back." Jack's throat tightened as the present bled back into focus. That day had finally come, but instead of laughing together, he was left standing alone at his friend's grave. The old man's knees buckled under the weight of it all. He clutched a rusted iron fence post to steady himself. Passers-by gave curious glances, but did not stop. They could not see the ghosts that walked beside him. Suddenly, a hand reached out. It was Private Collins, the young guard who had turned him away. The boy had followed him beyond the gates, his eyes earnest, almost pleading. "Sir, would you tell me more?" "About him. About both of you." Jack studied the boy for a long moment, then gave a weary nod. His voice, though cracked with age, carried the power of truth. "Sit with me, son. If you want to know a soldier, you must know the battles he carried inside." And so they sat together on a bench beneath a tree, the old man's words weaving the past into the present. Collins listened with wide eyes, drinking in every word. For the first time in years, Jack's stories did not vanish into silence. They were heard, carried forward alive again. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold over the rows of gravestones, Collins understood that he was not just a soldier guarding a ceremony. He was the heir to a legacy, one he would carry with honor. And Jack, the forgotten veteran, no longer felt alone. Weeks passed after the funeral, but the memory of it never left Private Collins. He couldn't shake the image of the frail old man, his trembling hands clutching that faded photograph, nor could he forget the way the general himself had stopped the world to honor him. Collins sought Jack out. He found him in a small, weathered house at the edge of town, where medals gathered dust on the mantel and photographs, yellowed with time, lined the walls. Jack welcomed him in with a tired smile, as if he had been waiting for someone who would finally listen. Every evening after drills, Collins came back. He listened as Jack spoke of the long marches through mud, of comrades who never came home, of nights where the only warmth was the promise of brotherhood. Jack's stories weren't just about war. They were about loyalty, sacrifice, and love for men who became family in the fire. One night, Jack placed the faded photograph in Collins' hand. "You keep this now," he said softly. Collins shook his head. "Sir, this belongs to you." But Jack's eyes glistened. "No, it belongs to all of us who are still here. You're young. You'll carry it further than I ever could. Promise me, when you wear that uniform, you'll remember. It's not just cloth. It's memory. It's blood. It's life." Collins swallowed hard and nodded. "I promise." A month later, Jack passed quietly in his sleep. No headlines, no fanfare, just the silence of an old soldier's last battle ending. But at his funeral, it was Collins who stood tall. He wore his uniform pressed and sharp, and in his hand he held the very photograph of two muddy young soldiers. When it was his turn to step forward, Collins placed the photo on Jack's casket. His voice rang clear across the cemetery. "This man taught me that war is not just about fighting. It is about keeping promises. And today I promise to carry his story and his brother's story with me, wherever I go." The soldiers in formation saluted. The general himself bowed his head, and just as the taps began to play, a single red flower fell onto the casket, carried by the wind, as if the brother Jack had buried so many years ago was welcoming him home. Collins stood straighter than ever before. He knew now that he wasn't just guarding ranks and ceremonies. He was guarding memory, guarding brotherhood. And in that moment, the torch had truly been passed. Years later, Collins found himself no longer a private, but a sergeant leading his own squad of young recruits. They looked at him with the same wide eyes he had once carried, full of questions, fears, and untested courage. On the eve of their first deployment, Collins gathered them in the barracks. The air buzzed with nervous energy. Boots lined in perfect rows, rifles cleaned to gleaming steel. He stood before them holding a small, carefully preserved photograph, Jack's photograph. "This," Collins began, his voice steady, "is not just paper. It's a story. Two men fought side by side in a war that nearly broke them. One of them became a general, the other faded into history, forgotten by most. But they made a promise to never leave each other behind." The recruits leaned closer, their chatter silenced. Collins' gaze swept over them. "I knew the man who carried this picture. He was frail, bent with age, but his spirit, stronger than any weapon. He taught me that this uniform isn't about medals or rank. It's about the man or woman next to you, the brother or sister who will one day depend on you more than life itself." One recruit raised his hand timidly. "Sergeant, what happened to him?" Collins's throat tightened, but he held firm. He passed on. "But before he did, he made me promise to carry his story, to remind the next generation that war is not glory, it's sacrifice, and that brotherhood is eternal." The room was silent. Then, one by one, the recruits stood and saluted, not to Collins, but to the photograph. That night, Collins tucked the photograph carefully into his chest pocket, close to his heart. And when the time came to lead his men into the unknown, he felt Jack walking beside him, whispering the same words the general once had, "Not without you, never without you." And so the story lived on, not in books, not in monuments, but in the living heartbeat of soldiers who carried it into each battle, into each act of courage, into each sacrifice. Jack and his brother-in-arms had not been forgotten. Through Collins and through those who followed, they had become eternal. Years rolled on. Collins's hair began to gray. His voice grew deeper with age. But the lessons he had carried from Jack never dimmed. He rose in rank, known not only for his skill in the field, but for the way he spoke about honor, brotherhood, and sacrifice. Soldiers said his words felt like old truths carved into stone. When peace finally came, Collins retired to a quiet town not far from the very cemetery where Jack and the General lay side by side. He often walked there in the evenings, cane in hand, his uniform long folded away, but the photograph always in his pocket. He would sit between the two graves and speak softly, as if his old mentors still listened. "Your promise carried me further than I ever thought I'd go," he would say, "and I've passed it on just like you asked." One autumn afternoon Collins returned again, but this time he wasn't alone. A group of young cadets followed him, eyes bright, notebooks in hand. They were part of a new program, learning not from books but from living veterans. The academy had invited Collins to speak, but instead of a classroom, he had brought them here, to the graves. He stood before them, his hand resting on the cool stone of Jack's marker. Men like him don't live in history books. They live in the people who remember them. And now, it's your turn. The cadets listened as Collins told the story from the beginning. The mud, the bullets, the promises, the funeral, the red flower, the photograph. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye among them. Finally, one cadet stepped forward, removing a single white flower from her hair. She placed it gently on Jack's grave and whispered, "We'll carry it now." Collins felt something lift from his shoulders. For decades, he had carried the photograph, the weight of Jack's legacy, the unbroken chain of brotherhood, and in that moment he knew it would not die with him. He looked to the sky where the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the cemetery in gold. "Rest easy, old friend," he whispered. "Your story is safe," and as the wind swept through the field of gravestones, carrying with it the faint echo of taps long since played, Collins smiled. The torch had passed again, and the fire would never be extinguished. Years later, Sergeant Collins himself grew frail. His steps slowed, his hair turned white, and his once strong hand shook as he held the same photograph. Jack had given him decades before, but his voice, though aged, still carried the weight of command, of truth, of loyalty. One crisp winter morning, Collins returned to the cemetery, leaning heavily on his cane. Snow dusted the rows of graves like a quiet blanket. He stopped before the stones of Jack and the General, his breath a mist in the air. "Brothers," he whispered, "I've kept my word. I carried your story, and I passed it to the young. Soon I'll be joining you." Behind him came footsteps, the sound of a dozen boots crunching the snow. A group of young soldiers approached, led by the same cadet who once placed a white flower on Jack's grave. Now she was an officer herself, her uniform crisp, her eyes steady. "Sergeant," she said softly, "we came to hear it one more time. Your story." Their story. Collins's eyes glistened. He sank onto the bench beneath the old oak tree, the same bench where he had first listened to Jack. The soldiers gathered around, and for the last time, Collins told the tale. He spoke of the jungle battles, of promises in the mud, of brotherhood stronger than death. He spoke of Jack's trembling hands, of the general's salute, of the flower left on a coffin draped in a flag. When his voice finally faded, silence held the air. The young officer stepped forward, kneeling before him. "We'll keep it alive, Sergeant. We'll tell it again and again. I promise." Collins pressed the photograph into her hand, his fingers trembling. "It's yours now. Protect it. Protect them." She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. That night Collins passed quietly in his sleep, just as Jack had. At his funeral, rows upon rows of soldiers stood in formation. The young officer stepped forward, holding the photograph high for all to see. This man carried the promise of two brothers who once fought side by side, she declared. And now we carry it. Their story will never be forgotten. A hush fell, and then, like a wave, the soldiers raised their hands in salute. The sound of taps echoed across the snow, carried by the wind like a hymn. And as the sun dipped low on the horizon, the graves of three soldiers, Jack, the general, and now Collins, stood together, bound not by blood or rank, but by loyalty eternal. Their brotherhood, born in war, had become a legend carried by generations. The chain was unbroken. The torch still burned. And somewhere in the silence it was as if three voices whispered the same vow. "Not without you. Never without you."